It is the fall of 1941, and the English Channel remains the center of a gruesome air war between the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. After more than a year of costly fighting against the cutting-edge Messerschmitt Me-109, the Royal Air Force, now with a steady supply of Spitfire Mark Vs, is finally enjoying success over the Luftwaffe, pushing back Hitler's powerful air force slowly deeper into France. But suddenly, this moment of hope for the British would be brought crashing down when, out of nowhere, a new opponent entered the fray. A small but sleek aircraft, a radial engine, was seen with German markings tearing through the skies and seemingly clearly outperforming both the Me-109 and the Supermarine Spitfire. Out of almost nowhere, Allied casualties began to come and Spitfire losses went up, while not even the highest British intelligence had any idea what this new aircraft was. So, how did we get here? And what was this mysterious new fighter? And most importantly, could the Allies find an answer to this deadly new aircraft? The beginnings of this new fighter would start in 1937, when the German Ministry of Aviation sent out a request for a new fighter aircraft to fight alongside the Me-109. And while many designs were submitted, it was not until a radial engine concept from a designer by the name of Kurt Tank that the ministry's attention was aroused. The concept of a radial engine was rare in the late 1930s, as many believed that the outdated shape would cause too much drag for designs to be competitive in speed. But Kurt Tank was not convinced. His thinking was outlined as follows.
The Messerschmitt 109 and the British Spitfire, the two fastest fighters in the world. At the time we began work on the Focke-Wulf 190, could both be summed up as a very large engine on the front of the smallest possible airframe. In each case, armament had been added almost as an afterthought. These designs, both of which admittedly proved successful, could be likened to racehorses. Given the right amount of pampering and easy course, they could outrun anything. But the moment the going became tough, they were liable to falter. During World War I, I served in the cavalry and in the infantry. I had seen the harsh conditions under which military equipment had to work in wartime. I felt sure that a quite different breed of fighter would also have a place in any future conflict. One that could operate from ill-prepared frontline airfields, one that could be flown and maintained by men who had received only short training, and one that could absorb a reasonable amount of battle damage and still get back. This was the background thinking behind the Focke-Wulf 190. It was not to be a racehorse, but a Dienstpferd, a cavalry horse.
Fortunately for Tank, this cavalry horse would be an easy sell for the Ministry of Aviation, as it was one of the only designs that would use a BMW 139 radial engine, allowing it to not compete with the Messerschmitt Me-109 for engines, and instead create a totally separate production line. Once this design was finalized and production began, this new aircraft, dubbed the Focke-Wulf 190, would begin arriving for testing at frontline fighter units. Although it initially was received with doubt, the 190 quickly became a favorite to pilots and grounds crews alike. With her sturdy, outward extending landing gear, it was easier to taxi, take off, and fly, and was able to take more of a beating than its Messerschmitt counterpart. Being liquid-cooled, the 109 was always susceptible to fire. But the 190 could not only deal a heavy blow with its machine guns and 20mm cannons, but also could take one herself, with a radial engine and additional armor. This allowed her a much better chance of getting her pilots back home safely. But furthermore, it quickly became clear that the 190 was no slouch in the air either. While the Messerschmitt did maintain the high-altitude performance advantage, the 190 was faster and handled far better at low to mid-altitude, which was, in reality, where most dogfights were taking place at this time. This was due to the fact that her engine was designed for these altitudes. She also would boast a greater range than the 109, and this was another feature that was quickly proving to be a crucial characteristic in fighter planes. But also making it a widely liked aircraft was the new bubble canopy that was featured on the 190, allowing for a wider and clearer field of view for the pilot. Within this cockpit, the layout of the Focke-Wulf 190 was also becoming known as ideal for the combat pilot. It was well organized and felt like a cohesive control dashboard and was fairly easy to learn and memorize, which was once again a large contrast from that of the 109. All of these factors would combine for what would come to be known very soon as a friendly aircraft for pilots, especially when compared to the rest of the German fighter force. The greatest downside of the 190 would be that with its small wing surface, the Focke-Wulf did not perform well at the thin air of high altitudes. This small wing area created a higher stall speed as well and made the 190 less maneuverable over 15 or 20,000 feet. And as we will see, this weakness would cause many issues later on. But for the time being, high-altitude performance was far from the priority. In 1941, when testing was complete and production would begin, the primary battlefield was the Western Front, and the primary adversary of the German Air Force was the RAF and its premier fighter, the Spitfire. Currently, the Luftwaffe was on their heels, having been repelled in the Battle of Britain. And now they were at hard work attempting to keep the Royal Air Force fighter patrols away from the French coast. But once again, Hermann Göring's fighter groups were losing this battle, with penetrations across the French countryside going deeper and deeper every month. The Messerschmitt Me 109s currently in use were good, there was no doubt about that. And during the Battle of Britain, they may have even been the better aircraft. The 109 was more heavily armed, climbed and dove faster, and had greater control stability than the Spitfire, according to most pilots, despite the Spit's unmatched ability to turn. But for the most part, the two aircraft were an even match, and the outcome of battle was largely determined by the skill of the pilot and starting position in the engagement. However, the Spitfire Mark I that was used in the Battle of Britain would not be the only adversary implemented onto the battlefield. As the battle raged and improvements were made, eventually the Mark V would enter the battle with improved handling characteristics and most notably two 20mm cannons in the wings. The Royal Air Force no doubt thought that this new and improved cutting-edge fighter would give them the upper hand in the intense air battle over the Channel and France. But these hopes would come crashing down in the fall of 1941, when one of the leading German aces, Adolf Galland, and his unit, JG-26, were officially given the first Focke-Wulf 190s at their forward air bases in France. The British had just recently dealt heavy losses to this unit throughout the summer, and finally were topping the scoreboard against their Messerschmitt foes. Things were, apparently, turning around for the Brits. But then, in early September 1941, on rhubarb and patrol missions over France, RAF Spitfires suddenly found themselves engaged by a strange new aircraft. This mysterious bird was a radial engine with smaller wings and a round shape. But even more alarming than the unknown aircraft was the fact that this fighter, more so than any they had seen before, was inexplicably fast. It could move like no other radial engine aircraft that anyone had seen before. And so, appropriately, RAF pilots immediately reported this new occurrence to British intelligence. And the British intel was so completely caught off guard by this new aircraft that they would shortly thereafter reply to their pilots, telling them that the unknown radial engine fighter had to be the outdated Curtiss P-36 Mohawk, which the Germans had apparently captured from the French. To which, supposedly, the Royal Air Force Spitfire pilots then replied, "In that case, please get us some Curtiss P-36s to fly." But in reality, the RAF pilots knew that this new aircraft wasn't a P-36. And apparently, the truth was soon discovered. Looking back here, we can see an archived issue of the New York Times from October 2nd of 1941, just a few weeks after these mysterious aircraft began to appear on the scene. Here, in addition to the Yankees downing the Dodgers 3-2 in the World Series opener, we can see another notorious organization making headlines, the Luftwaffe. On the right side of page 4, we can see the first ever article to mention the Focke-Wulf 190, with the mysterious new plane now positively identified. The excerpt reads as follows.
London, October 1st. The Germans were reported today to be using a new radial engine fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, armed with 6 or 8 machine guns on the Western Front. The plane resembles the American-built Curtiss Hawk, an export version of the P-40. A Polish squadron last week reported shooting down a very fast radial engine fighter, at first thought to be one of the Curtiss planes delivered to France before the Franco-German armistice. Because of its high speed, however, the plane is now believed to have been the FW-190.
In the coming months, a few German groups were beginning to transition over to the 190 fully, with the most notable being JG2 and Galan's JG26. With 2 new fighter units now completely operating the cutting-edge fighters, the tide of the air war shifted, and all British momentum was lost. For the next 6 months, the Luftwaffe turned back the British patrols, with German losses going down and the RAF casualties ticking upwards. The apex of this turn was no doubt the famed Channel Dash that took place in February of 1942, where German fighter escort, led by Adolf Galland, repelled multiple British attacks on 2 German battleships as they bolted through the English Channel onto safer waters. The final score for JG26 alone in this engagement was 7 confirmed kills, along with 6 probables, all for the loss of just 4 of their own. They beat away Fury Swordfish and their escorting fighters with their newly equipped 190s in what Galland would call his finest moment. Because of the German victory, British morale took a major hit, with the Times in Britain famously writing a few days later.
Nothing more mortifying to the pride of our sea power has happened since the 17th century. It spelled the end of the Royal Navy legend that in wartime, no enemy battle fleet could pass through what we proudly call the English Channel.
It was now more clear than ever that the Focke-Wulf 190 was turning the tide. As the spring came along, the Focke-Wulf continued its domination over the low-level patrols and rhubarb missions along the coast of France, with RAF Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson later stating,
"Yes, the Focke-Wulf 190 was causing us real problems at this time. We could outturn it, but you couldn't turn all day. As the number of 190s increased, so the depth of our penetrations decreased. They drove us back to the coast, really."
As the spring came and went, the trend continued. In April alone, 48 fighter command losses were directly linked to JG-26 and their new 190s. May was much of the same, and finally, the Luftwaffe possessed complete air superiority in Western Europe beyond any shadow of a doubt. But then, in the summer of 1942, something would happen that would disrupt the entire battle, one of the single greatest blunders in the entire war. In JG2, the other German fighter group that was equipped with Focke-Wulf 190s, was a young man by the name of Armin Faber. Oberleutnant Faber, who was assigned to administrative and paperwork duties for his group, was given special permission to fly a combat mission with his squadron. On June 23rd of 1942, the young man, who was normally busy with paperwork duties, joined the flight led by famed German ace Egon Meyer, now part of an intercepting force of 190s headed to cut down a British light bomber raid. Over the channel, they would spot the enemy and a large dogfight began. But before any bombers could be hit, RAF Bostons evaded, and instead, Spitfires of 310 Squadron arrived to defend. In the ensuing battle, the inexperienced Faber found himself with a Spitfire on his tail. He dove away at high speed, flying north for a lengthy period of time. Eventually, in what was no doubt an intense one-on-one engagement, Faber resorted to attempting an Immelmann, a move which he had only read about. Somehow, the maneuver would work, and the rookie German pilot downed the experienced Spitfire in a head-on attack, adding what can only be considered more clear evidence to the lethality and ability of the 190. The German pilot, now scoring his first kill on a special permission mission, then circled and saluted his opponent in his parachute before heading away. But this elation would be short-lived. In the engagement, Faber, who was not properly experienced in navigation, became disoriented in the battle. He had no friendlies nearby and was all alone, currently believing that he was over France. Unfortunately, he had been flying in the total opposite direction and was instead actually over southern England. He proceeded to fly over a British training airfield which he believed to be his own, where he did a victory roll and then brought his Focke-Wulf down on the airfield. He would have no doubt been fired upon, but he was so far inland over Britain that he had actually landed at an RAF training base which had no weapons on the premises. Instead, he lowered his gear and came in for a landing, where RAF ground crews, in total disbelief, directed him casually to park the aircraft before jumping on the wing and taking him prisoner. For context on just how massive this blunder truly was, being an administrative staff member for the group commander, Armin Faber was all too familiar with the rules of secrecy for the Focke-Wulf 190. He had in fact personally handed over the written order from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, which clearly stated that no Focke-Wulf fighter was to cross the channel, and instead must turn back to France upon reaching halfway to protect the confidentiality of the new aircraft. Yet here he was, being apprehended by the British from his cockpit and giving the Allies one of their most priceless gifts in the entire war, a completely intact Focke-Wulf 190 fighter. This would be a crucial intel breakthrough for the Royal Air Force, as it was taken in and tested, allowing the Allies to learn the secrets, strengths, and weaknesses of the most advanced plane currently in the war. Here, once again, we can see the New York Times coverage of this very incident.
London, August 4th. Experts of the Royal Air Force and the British Ministry of Aircraft Production have now got possession of a Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's latest fighter plane, intact, and are studying it in test flights and in the engineering laboratory, officials announced today. The Focke-Wulf was forced down on the English south coast recently after an air battle with British fighters, in which the Nazi pilot ran out of ammunition and gasoline. The German was overpowered by British guards before he could destroy his plane. The Nazis had tried to keep the secrets of the Focke-Wulf away from the British, apparently by orders that none was to fly across the Channel. But in the past week, this type of plane has appeared in enemy raids over England.
This truly could not have come at a better time. The 190's dominance was spreading, and in late 1942, the Focke-Wulf had even begun to arrive on the Eastern Front, seeing incredible success over Soviet aircraft, as well as the North African theater, gaining a reputation as a reliable and deadly ground attack fighter. But now, the British were setting out to work on leveling the playing field. In addition, while this was underway, as 1942 came to an end and the advantages of the 190 were being studied, another potential problem was on the horizon for the Luftwaffe and Focke-Wulf. This would be the United States Army Air Corps. By the spring of 1943, the first American bombers had begun to arrive in England, and it was clear that the Luftwaffe would soon have a new threat to deal with: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, as well as the B-24 Liberator. Initially, despite their size and defensive array, these two heavy bombers actually posed little problem for the 190s of the Luftwaffe, as the 8th Air Force suffered high losses in the first missions. This was because, in fact, the Focke-Wulf was ideal for this role. The American combat boxes of bombers did have thoroughly defended aircraft, with 10 or more 50 caliber machine guns spread across the bomber. But the 190 was a radial engine and could take this punishment. Furthermore, with its powerful cannons, it had enough firepower to get the job done. But even so, the Germans had begun to recognize that the Flying Fortress was extremely durable, and its ability to take a beating was unmatched. So they demanded even more firepower. And since the 190s still had no real challenger in the sky, they attempted to utilize more weapons to make her a bomber-destroyer. Many improvements were added to the 190's arsenal, as a new bomber interceptor model was added, at first the A6, and then later the A8. These new 190s entered service very soon to take on the new bomber threat. These models boasted a 30mm cannon and even unguided rockets for use specifically against heavy bomber formations. And these were, for a brief while, effective against the relatively small and unescorted bomber raids. These improvements and bomber attack modifications made the 190 even slower at high altitude though. But for the time, this was not a concern, as there were no competitors in the skies other than the lumbering heavy bombers. In fact, we can see here some of the early results. American and British bombers alike littering the countryside of Western Europe. It was clear that B-17s and B-24s were being lost at an alarming rate, and the Focke-Wulf 190 was more than carrying her share of the responsibility. But the Americans kept coming, with more fortresses and more liberators. And adding even more of a problem for the German fighters was that by the end of 1943, these bombers were not alone. Soon enough, American brass had learned the lesson the hard way, and the first fighter escorts were assigned to the daylight bombing raids in the form of RAF Spitfires. A little while later, the United States had brought in their own little friends to join the missions, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. And here we can see why this became such a problem for the Luftwaffe and its Focke-Wulfs. This is a top-secret report conducted by the United States on the comparative advantages of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Focke-Wulf 190. Within this, it is clear that the 190's strengths are at low altitude, and at slower speeds, with better performance below 5,000 feet and below 250 miles per hour. But as the altitudes went higher and the air thinned, the tables turned. In almost every test above 5 to 10,000 feet, the P-47 Thunderbolt jumped ahead as the clear winner, with more advantages being gained further up. Turning, for example, arrived at the following conclusions.
While the Focke-Wulf 190 could hang on its propeller and outturn the Thunderbolt at low speeds and low altitude, the P-47 easily outturned the Focke-Wulf at 10,000 feet and had to throttle back in order to keep from overrunning the 190. From here, the superiority of the P-47 Thunderbolt in turning only increased with altitude.
And, unfortunately for the Luftwaffe, where were the majority of dogfights beginning to take place with the arrival of the American heavy bombers and fighter escorts? The thin air of high altitude. This negated most of the advantages previously enjoyed by the Focke-Wulf in 1941 and 42. Because of this, as the battlefield changed, so did the results for the mighty Luftwaffe. The Focke-Wulf fighters could not compete with the British and American fighters in the high-altitude escort role. Losses were being taken by the experienced German units, and man by man, their numbers began to dwindle. Thus, changes had to be made. For the next year, the Luftwaffe tried to do everything possible to defend the daylight bombing raids. The best strategy that they would muster would be a battle formation consisting of the Focke-Wulf 190s, armed to the teeth to intercept the bombers, but now escorted by large units of light fighters. The faster Messerschmitt Me-109 flew above the Focke-Wulfs, supposedly to keep the escorting Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and newly introduced Mustangs away from the Focke-Wulf force, so that they could concentrate on the bombers. And while this strategy was, in theory, an excellent one, in practice it turned out to be difficult to execute under the pressures of war. These large formations ended up being difficult to coordinate, and it took too long to assemble, as intercepting bomber formations required timely form-ups. In addition, when American Mustangs began to implement fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber formations, this further stalled the German strategy, causing chaos and forcing the cumbersome 190s to dogfight when they were only outfitted for bomber attack. By the end of 1944, it was abundantly clear that as long as Allied fighters were in the air, the Focke-Wulf 190s, regardless of how heavily armed, could not be successful in destroying American bombers. The cost was simply too high. Despite the fact that the 190 was doing well enough in the skies over the Eastern Front, they were losing the battle in the West. The Germans simply had to have something that could take on the heavy bombers and their fighter escorts at the same time. Something with a heavy armament and elite performance at the thin air of high altitude. Finally, the German Air Ministry realized this and, albeit later than they should have, began work on a new high-altitude variant of the Focke-Wulf 190. This would be the D model, also known as the Dora, with a new Junkers Jumo 213 engine originally designed for exclusive use in bombers, as well as a pressurized cockpit. This new version of the 190 would have much better performance at high altitude, and could dogfight with the American fighters on a level playing field at 25,000 feet. This long-nose model was a formidable opponent, at least as good as the new American Mustang, and began to enter the skies over Western Europe in October of 1944 with JG-54. The early results here were promising, downing 4 British Lancasters and 1 Mosquito on its very first operational sortie, all for the loss of just 1 Langnasen, or long nose. very soon, by the end of the year, numerous other frontline units in the West began to receive the first D Model 190s. But on January 1st, with the ill-fated Operation Bodenplatte, destined to see the loss of 250 fighters, many pilots and valuable tanks of fuel would be gone in a single sortie, leaving the Luftwaffe on its heels. For the rest of the spring, the remaining Dora models would see service, and in the right hands, success. But there were so few of these experienced hands available to fly the long-nose models that it mattered little against the thousands of American bombers and fighters taking off almost daily. At the same time, Kurtztank was already hard at work on what would be the final model of the Focke-Wulf 190 tree, the most advanced version yet perceived, the Focke-Wulf TA-152. This would be another high-altitude development stemming from the design of the D model, but with much larger wings. It also entered service, but in even more scarce numbers. Less than 70 TA-152s were likely made due to Germany's situation in the war. These new fighters would also see success on the rare occasion that they were able to make it to the combat zone with adequate pilots, downing 7 Allied aircraft for only 4 losses of their own. But this would be in March and April of 1945, when the war was already lost. Throughout the entire war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was one of the mainstays of the conflict and part of the backbone of the Luftwaffe. In every theater and with every new model, it was generally as good as, if not better than, the prominent frontline fighter in use by the Allies. However, always battling advantages of American production and limited German supplies, this legendary fighter rarely fought from an advantageous position. Instead, she was destined for defeat, fighting for the wrong side of the war. But nonetheless, the Focke-Wulf 190 was one of the most lethal and advanced fighter planes ever entered into the battlefield. By 1945, this is where many of the Focke-Wulfs ended up, in flames and on the ground. And in case you're wondering what this piece of paper is, it's an authentic 80-year-old certificate for the credit of one Focke-Wulf 190 by an American anti-aircraft battery on January 1st of 1945. I was able to hunt this down along with a handwritten letter from the AA battery commander who helped to bring it down. If you want to read this brutal and real first-hand account of a Focke-Wulf 190 attack and destruction, join my project, Letters from War. Each month, get a copy of an authentic letter from a soldier overseas, along with documents, photos, and even a history quiz delivered right to your door. Go to the link below and use code FW190 for 15% off any order. That is code FW190 for 15% off any order. Learn history in the best way possible, with handwritten accounts of the men who lived it. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue to make more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.